This video will focus on the living conditions during industrial Britain. On your exam, it might refer to this time period as the 19th century as well. And the time period it's talking about is 1750 to the 1900s. So this video will look over these parts of the specification, the first two bullet points. So we've got a bit of an overview about industrialisation and the growth of major cities, political change, and also the living conditions in these towns and cities. So let's have a look then at a bit of an overview first. So during this time period, there was lots of change happening, and Britain at the end of this period in 1900 was very different from what it looks like at the beginning of this time period in 1750. The main reason being that it was the time of the Industrial Revolution. So during this time period we see a huge movement of people from the countryside into the towns in search of work. We also see movement of people from town to town because of better transport by the railways. Work changed dramatically during this time period. So at the beginning of this time period, lots of people worked in the countryside or at home, but people stopped working from home and worked in the factories. Machinery in the countryside also made supply of food easier as well. So we see technology being a big reason for change during this time period. Let's have a look at the third bullet point, so democracy. So more and more men were given the right to vote, and this happened in three stages: 1832, 1867, but 1884, so that's 1884 was the big one, and that is where we end up seeing all men of all classes were allowed to vote. The impact of this was that governments had to take more notice of the needs of the poorer people, and it was a big driver in public health and laws and acts being passed because the franchise, the vote, was now given to all men. Society, there was changes in society as well. So the middle classes had grown in number and power. The working classes were largely ignored as their living conditions worsened. You know, towards the end of the time period where we see all men getting the vote, we see changes in these living conditions. But remember, that was 1884. That was towards the end of this time period. Also, when thinking about society, by 1870, children under 10 were given free education. So there's a bit of a change there, a bit of a shift towards this importance being put on education. Next bullet point down, we're looking at transport and technology. So railways with steam, trains transported goods nationwide. Steamships sailed with goods to and from the British Empire as well. So there was lots of opportunities for trade. Wealth grew dramatically during this time period in Britain. But the impact on the working classes and living conditions, were quite slow in helping those improve, even though Britain became a very rich country due to the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, people's ideas changed. So there was a theory of evolution was accepted, and because of that, religion declined. And we also have major discoveries by scientists such as Louis Pasteur and the germ theory, and proving that it was germs that caused disease, because the common theory was before this time that it was miasma. So that's a bit of an overview of features of industrial Britain. So let's have a look then at living conditions. So, key point. So living and working conditions during the industrial period were terrible for the urban poor, right, for the poor people living in cities and towns. Due to industrialisation, people moved from the countryside to towns and found themselves in overcrowded, poorly built slum housing. Disease was rife, and the main cause of this, was by dirty water. And we see cholera being a big issue during this time period, as well as typhoid too. So, despite this, by the end of the period, the growth of democracy and trade unionism showed the government that poorer people needed help. And I put this image down here of trade unionists, campaigning for better pay and conditions and wages. So let's have a look then at what the living conditions were like. So first of all, it's the living conditions were appalling, and the conditions that people lived in directly harmed people's health. One of the reasons being, so we can kind of split this up into three reasons. So overcrowding would be one. Two, there was no help for the poor, and three, disease was common. So let's have a look at overcrowding. So what causes this problem then? Well, migration, so the movement of people from the countryside of people looking for work. Housing quality was poor and rents were high. Families often lived in one room, really cramped, unsanitary, unhealthy conditions. So the effect this had then on people's health, on public health, well, there weren't enough privies, so toilets, so human waste flowed onto the streets causing disease. Diseases like tuberculosis, which was like a lung disease, were common because of the damp walls and the poorly built houses. There was no regulation in terms of building. So let's have a look now at this idea of no help for the poor. So thinking about what caused this feature. So richer people who ran the town councils, so like the local councils, did not want to see the taxes increased to pay for water and waste facilities. Governments believed in this idea of laissez-faire, this leaving alone, which said that they should not interfere in people's lives. Now the impact on public health then. Well, working class men were only given the vote in 1867. And there were no free healthcare, so doctors and medicines had to be paid for. The poor could not afford this, so their health got worse. They could not afford healthcare because it wasn't free. And lastly, disease was common. So until 1861, people did not know about germs. Many people had to drink the dirty water, and the 6 biggest killers of the industrial age were tuberculosis, influenza, diphtheria, typhoid, typhus and cholera. In an exam, if you mention diseases, please try to make sure you name the actual diseases as well. That will help you get more marks. Also, disease being common was because people live close together. Well, the effects on public health then of these common diseases as well. Disease spread quickly. People could not understand why because they didn't understand the cause of illness. Life expectancy was really low. So infant mortality, so infant death rate was high. In the later part of the period, scientists researched health issues and made breakthroughs by observing city life. Also, another aspect to living conditions was the quality of accommodation. So the cheapest accommodation was a rented cellar space which was damp and not ventilated, again increasing the chance of picking up diseases. Back-to-back housing was cheap but was poorly constructed. A family often had just one room downstairs and another room up and another upstairs. The effect on health was significant as a lack of fresh air led to chest infections and lung-related diseases like tuberculosis. Also, Private water companies were unregulated and waste remained a problem. And this is a feature that we see, throughout many, the time periods of the course that we are studying. So water companies sourced their water from ponds, rivers and streams. The water was often dirty and unhealthy. Typhoid and cholera were prevalent. These typhoid and cholera were waterborne diseases. In the early part of the period, people still did not understand that dirty water caused disease, thought it was miasma. In most areas of cheap industrial housing, the sewers could not cope with the amount of human waste. Privies collected waste, which built up until it was emptied or it overflowed. In a typical street of industrial housing, over 10 families shared one toilet, so one privy. There were some developments during the period, but they often created more problems. For example, where better sewers were built, the waste emptied into the rivers where water companies got their fresh water from. So it was a bit of a vicious circle there, a vicious cycle. And my last point I want to explain about living conditions is the industrial working class's poor diet, which caused malnutrition and a weakened immune system. So the diet of the industrial working class was basic: potatoes, bread, butter, beer and tea. Beer was actually cheaper than tea. In the towns and cities, it was often difficult to obtain fruit and vegetables, and this contributed to malnutrition, so the lack of the right nutrients in someone's diet. The diet was high in carbohydrates. That was needed because of the long hours of labour, of work in the factories. And until the end of the 19th century, there was no government regulation, so there was no checking of quality, no quality checks of food. So working class families often ate food which had been mixed with other products. This is often called adulteration. Also, cheap meat was sometimes available to the underprivileged, so the poor, but the quality of the meat was very poor, sometimes from diseased animals. And there is a very famous cartoon from a Punch magazine showing all the issues of an industrial city, the overcrowding, the dirt on the street, people sharing lodgings. It shows the conditions pretty well in there.